Okay, thank you all for coming. I'm Summer. I'm the curator here at the museum. Before we get started, everybody please take a second to turn off or silence your phones so we don't have any disruption. As for announcements, on December 3rd and 4th, we will be having our annual holiday home tour. Tickets are now for sale online only. You can find them on the main page of our website, ameliamuseum.org, so be sure to get them before they sell out. And we have wrap cards with more information about Holiday Home Tour on that table right there. In celebration of Halloween, for all of October, we're offering Saturday ghost tours in addition to our regular Friday ghost tours. These are walking tours of our historic downtown spookier side. You can purchase your tickets on our website or at the museum in person. They are $15 for adults and $10 for children. And these tours start at 6 p.m. Our next brown bag on November 3rd will be with Eric Schmidt from West Rock, who will talk about the history of paper mills on the island. And then our next Third on Third on November 19th will be with Dr. Michael Butler. As part of the Florida Humanities Florida Talk series, he will speak about Martin Luther King Jr.'s time in St. Augustine during the Civil Rights Movement. Also, if you have an evaluation sheet at your seat, please fill it out after the program and return it to that basket at that back table. So that's it for announcements, but tonight we have Dr. Denise Bossy from UNF. Dr. Bossy is an associate professor of history specializing in cross-cultural relations between Indians, Europeans, and Africans in the early South. Her current research focuses on the Yamasee Indians of Florida, Georgia, and South Carolina. She joined the faculty at the University of North Florida in 2007 after teaching at Trinity College in Hartford, Connecticut for 2 years. Her research regularly takes her to archives across the South and Great Britain. So everyone, please welcome Dr. Bossy. Hi, everybody. I'm going to take off my mask, which feels really dangerous. Yeah. I'm going to live on the edge tonight. Thank you all for coming. It's an interesting time to give public talks, and I really appreciate you being here. Almost all of my conferences are perpetually being canceled, so I'm very rarely in a room with other folks who I can talk to about my work other than my students and my colleagues. So I'm just grateful to have this chance to be with you. And it's been wonderful over the years to work with Amelia Island Museum. I found them to be just a wonderful organization, really devoted to telling a richer, fuller history of our past, and that really inspires me. Okay, I'm going to try to use this. Let's see. Okay. Hitapwenu nake terala isako nimane akala. This means it's good that y'all have come. I am very happy. And this is in Mocamas, which is our local Timucua dialect. This is our local indigenous language. And the only reason that I can say this phrase is that there's an amazing scholar at the University of Florida named Dr. Aaron Broadwell who has carefully been reconstructing our indigenous language. Wow. And there's actually a web dictionary, if you're interested, where you can type in any word you want to know and up it will pop. And he has been carefully doing this language work for years. Mocama was actually first recorded in the early 17th century, supposedly by Spanish Franciscans, although he's discovered that the real linguists at the heart of that project were, in fact, indigenous people. They were the main scholars. And it's the largest corpus, the second largest corpus of indigenous language material in all of the present-day United States. And he's the first scholar to reconstruct it. In the next 10 years, what we understand about our local indigenous people is going to be completely transformed through his work. It's thousands and thousands of pages of text. So I'm particularly happy to share that with you. So I'm going to start with a land acknowledgement. I'm going to acknowledge that we are on the unceded ancestral homelands of the Mocamas-speaking Timucuas, and that other indigenous people also made this space, Amelia Island, into their homelands, including the Yamasees and the Guales. For thousands of years, indigenous people made this region into a vibrant center of diplomacy, exchange, and religious practice. And so I'm going to pay respect to those nations and to their descendants. I also want to recognize the historical and ongoing impact of colonization in our region and state, as well as the resiliency of indigenous people. Today, Florida is home to the sovereign nations of the Seminole Tribe of Florida and the Miccosukee Tribe of Indians of Florida, as well as citizens of other Native nations and communities whose ancestors include Mocamas, Yamasees, and Guales. So I just offer a little map here to orient ourselves, and this is, right around the period of contact. This is what indigenous Florida and our region would have looked like. The Guale, Mocama are especially who I'm going to be talking about today, but also the Yamasees. So I want tonight to propose a new way of understanding the history of Amelia Island through the early 18th century, one that views this space through the lenses of the three different indigenous communities who made this space into their homelands. And collectively, if we looked at the history of Amelia Island, if we sort of did some math, we would find that close to 98% of the human history here is indigenous. So, for example, that timeline should be 98% indigenous, and then just the last little bit, would be what we tend to focus on. I partner with an archaeologist, and so all of this information comes from him. He tells me that the oldest Paleo-Indian stone point to be found in our region is over 12,000 years old. It was found on Ponte Vedra Beach, probably left here by Indians as they moved through their area. I've since discovered that water was really important to determining where people lived. And so for quite a while, when our coastline was much farther out, about 70 miles out farther, people lived farther and closer to the coast where the water came to the surface more readily. Probably about 5,000 years ago, when the estuary started to stabilize, that's when we started to see Native people make more permanent homes in our area. Archaeologists, for example, have discovered an early permanent settlement site at Spencer's Midden in Atlantic Beach, close to the Intracoastal. And closer to Amelia Island, a shell ring off the southwest edge of Black Hammock Island that dates to about 2,550 before Common Era. And what I would also say is that Native people controlled this space into the early 18th century. We often tell a narrative of the Spanish wresting control, but as I'll make clear, there were very few Spaniards here and many more indigenous people. So who is actually in control? Another statistic, as I say, is demographics. So scholars estimate that about 200 to 300,000 Native people lived in our sort of greater region on the eve of contact. And this is mostly a Timucua statistic. It would take until the 19th century for the state population to reach this level again. This is a deeply populated space on the eve of contact. And one of the other things that I want to propose is that those few Spaniards who did live here on Amelia Island, they were mostly soldiers, a handful of friars, and every once in a while near the island there might be a rancher taking up space and establishing cattle herds. That they largely lived in an indigenous world in so many ways, from the foods that they ate, to the types of homes that they built, to the people that they interacted with. These were mostly indigenous worlds. So I want us to kind of reconceptualize the way that we think about much of the 16th, 17th, and early 18th centuries. Another thing that we tend to do when we talk about contact is we tend to talk about it as only happening in one way. So we often presume that the Spanish changed Native people and Native people didn't change the Spanish. So I want us to also think about cultural interaction as a two-way street. So I'm going to talk just a little bit about the three different communities of Native people who made Amelia Island and its surroundings into their homelands. And of course, the first are the Mocamas. The Mocama term is really a term for a dialect, the dialect that I opened with. It represents a community of people who spoke a shared form of Timucua, but who lived in different polities, discrete, independent towns and chiefdoms. And this is around 1665. This is sort of 1660s. And you'll see that here is Mocama and here is Guale. For a long time, scholars thought that Mocama was an isolate, a language isolate, but more recently Broadwell has started to think that it was Muskogean, which Wale is too. And this is a Muskogean language family, like Creek. And so it's likely that they spoke a related language. This is sort of cutting edge new research. And what you'll see here are a number of different communities, including Alamacani and Santa Maria on Amelia Island. And I want to emphasize that these different towns represent just what the Spanish knew, just what they knew, the limits of their knowledge. So the Spanish would often, and these are the records, of course, that we draw on, the Spanish would often highlight simply the communities that they interacted with, the communities that allowed them to establish a doctrina, which was like a central church area, and they would often talk about sort of this woods, these forests, where there are all of these indigenous people that really are just on the edge of what they know. So we know the most about these sort of coastal territories because this is what the Spanish know about. But behind the coast is an entirely different indigenous, interconnected world that is ancient and also modern, that is connected to not only spaces within the region, but beyond it too. So the Mocamas are the community that we know are here at Contact. And then in 1667, another community of indigenous people moved into the region, and these are the Yamasees. And I've been working on the Yamasees for about 250 years. I mean, this book that I have written is outrageously long, and it's taken me so long to do, and I turned it in last Friday. I'm really, relieved and happy. So I have one book out on the Yamasees that it's a collection of essays that came out several years ago out of a conference that I organized in St. Augustine. And I have this other book that I've just finished that's the first comprehensive history of the Yamasees from the 11th century to the 1770s. It's way too long, way too much long. So if you have any Yamasee questions and I can't answer them, then I don't know.
Professor, would you mind just positioning where that is in terms of where we are?
This is us right here. Right here, Amelia Island.
Oh, okay. Thank you very much.
Oh, no, that's my pleasure. These maps come out of a series of maps that we made for the Jacksonville Beaches Museum. We have a permanent exhibit there on Indigenous Florida. And they actually move, so there's a moving component to this that shows all of the mobility, which I'll talk about in a moment. But a lot of what I'm going to be talking about is the second half of the 17th century when Amelia Island and the rest of the coastline really becomes a very active space where we have indigenous people moving around a lot in response to colonization. Establishing homelands that they think of as their homelands and that they are their homelands, but also moving for different opportunities as part of this larger sort of response to colonization. So that's what this is. This is the second phase of movement. So for a very long time, Mocama-speaking Timucuas have made Amelia Island and the surrounding space theirs. And they're still here, but they begin to move off of this island. In 1667, when the Yamasees begin to move in, they move on to Amelia Island because there's already developed land here. Mocama space is here. There are already fields. There are already homesteads cleared. And they actually reoccupy a lot of former Mocama towns, and they make them into Yamasee towns. The Yamasees are a really interesting community, and the reason that I'm sort of one of the first scholars to really look deeply at them is because they used mobility as a form of power. In response to colonization, they took up mobility, and yet they also placed themselves, put themselves in, anchored themselves to spaces. Their ancestors come from the interior of Georgia. Here, these are their ancestral chiefdoms. And this is just a rough sketch of some of the places they lived between 1600 and 1725. So in the 1650s, they're living here. They are descendants of very powerful chiefdoms who have encountered Hernando de Soto, the really infamous conquistador who traveled over 4,000 miles through the South for years. And what's remarkable is that during his expedition, as he moves he sort of moves this way, and he goes through here, and he goes all around, and then he winds up dying at the Mississippi River. When he moves through interior Georgia, everything's peaceful. They manage him so deftly through diplomacy that although he's been extraordinarily violent in other places, using things like war dogs, and he brings so much change to enslave indigenous people, and he is not above throwing Indigenous people to the dogs and using all sorts of forms of torture to get what he wants. He is a conquistador. When he gets to interior Georgia, they so deftly manage him that they move him through their communities and out, and then just point him to their enemies and say, this is a really good place to go. You should go to Kapitacheki. And that's a place he wants to go. But they've been at war for so long that the roads aren't even cleared. And they take him there and they just sort of deposit him there. And then they attack and sack a temple and they leave. And these are the people who become the Yamasees. In the 1650s, 110 years later, they are assaulted by a series of slave raids. And it's a story that we often don't talk about in public, but scholars have really been doing a lot of work on Indigenous enslavement, and what they've discovered is that between the 16th and 19th centuries across the Americas, north, south, into the Caribbean, about 5 million Indigenous people were enslaved. So this is a period of both the enslavement of Africans and the enslavement of Native people in the Americas. It's an enslavement of Indigenous people globally. About 12.5 million Africans and about 5 million Native people from the Americas are enslaved. And they're often working in the same, plantations in the same spaces. They're part of that same global network of enslavement. So this affects our region. And it affects Florida tremendously, but in the 1650s it especially affects these folks in interior Georgia. There are slavers called the Westos who are partnered with Virginia traders who are eager to have Indian slaves on their plantations in Virginia or to export them to other parts of the America, including the Caribbean. And they arm them with guns, they trade for guns, and they come into interior Georgia and they attack what have been very powerful chiefdoms. And we don't have a lot of records. But they surely tried to do what they did with Soto. They surely tried to use diplomacy first and then went to violence and then were forced to flee and experience a profound form of diaspora. They're totally disconnected from their homelands. They move in multiple different directions. And several hundred refugees go down the Savannah River to the mouth of the river, where for the first time they begin to call themselves the Yamasees. They then connect with the Guales, who they have ancient kinship ties to and diplomatic networks to, and they begin to move into our region because the Westos have followed them down the Savannah River and are slaving again, now around the coast. And so seeking safe harbor, they begin to move into our region, and this is when they move on to Amelia Island. They also move across Florida. They're really amazing. They're mobile and networked, and so they establish settlements here, and they establish settlements in Appalachia, and they establish settlements in Apalachicola, which are the lower creeks, and they establish a settlement eventually, very briefly, down the St. Johns River, and they connect them all. And they're tapping into Indigenous networks, and they're connecting to one another. And they create this amazing dispersed community. And this is when they live on Amelia Island. And they become so powerful that they begin to rival the Spanish, which isn't that hard to do, actually. Sounds amazing. Sounds impressive. The Spanish number at the height of their empire in Florida, 1,500 people. It's really disappointing. They're teeny tiny. They're hanging on in St. Augustine, always broke, always depending on the Situato, which might not come, which is the annual subsidy that the crown gives them to survive. And they project authority in letters more than they project it in reality. And they also demand a lot to be part of the empire, right? They demand a lot. They're trying to transform Indigenous people into Spaniards, into Catholics, into tax-paying Spaniards. So the presence of a powerful native nation that suddenly moves into the area and that is incredibly networked is very appealing to a lot of Indigenous people. They're suddenly an alternative to Spanish power, and that is the Yamasees. And that's how they're going to carve their power out in the Southeast. They will shape the history of the early South through that mobility, through that networking, through that alternative that they offer to first Spanish and then also English colonization. They stay about 20 years in this region, and then they leave. And they go up to present-day South Carolina, and they take with them hundreds of Guales, who now become citizens of the Yamasee Nation, and leave our region. Some Guales stay here, and some go with them. But that is the third community of people who will make Amelia Island into their home, are the Guales. And they are initially from the coast of Georgia and just a bit inland. And at one point, they have a really huge center of Irene in present-day Savannah. That's their sort of mound center in the pre-contact period, their Mississippian mound center. And the Guales begin to move south. as everyone else is moving in this region in response to colonization. A variety of things are happening that are compelling people to move south and to contract. Those slave raids are beginning to affect them. The Westos are not only slaving in interior Georgia, but they also begin to attack coastal settlements here. At one point, there's a big standoff with the Spanish. We're here.
Where are we on that map?
Here we are.
Right here.
There, right there. I don't have a big, I'm only allowed to use a big stick.
There
we go. So there's slave raids that explain why they're moving and contracting. Also, folks have been leaving. Spanish missionization efforts have compelled many to leave. There have also been episodic regional epidemics. There's been also a lot of labor abuse, Spanish labor exploitation, and so there's been a lot of movement and contraction. We tend to tell this story as a story of collapse, but a lot of folks have actually been leaving. A lot of Indigenous people have networks elsewhere, and they've been going other places. Yes?
The Westos?
Yes, the Westos.
Are they like vigilantes? Or are they like...
They are survivors of Iroquoian raids. So as I say, like they're massive Indigenous connections. So they're Erie Indians who've survived a series of Iroquoian raids sparked by disease epidemics that run from the 1630s to the 1650s. And the Iroquois, or Haudenosaunee, begin to attack broadly to gain captives, largely for population replacement. And the Eries, who survived that, begin to move south, and they eventually, some of them move into Virginia, where they become known as a different word, but then ultimately the Westos. And they arm themselves and begin to become slavers in order to protect themselves, having now become refugees.
But they are Indigenous people.
They're Indigenous people. And the Yamasees are also going to become slavers. The Yamasees are hit by slave raids in the 1650s. They're hit by slave raids in the 1680s, and they say enough. There's no way to survive but to arm ourselves. The Spanish are not protecting us. We are going to militarize. So the Yamasees become, between the 1680s and 1715, one of the most powerful slaving militarized communities in the South, in partnership with the English and with the Creeks. And together, they're going to destroy most of the Indigenous settlements across northern Florida. They take out the western Timucuas. A lot of the Guales are actually recruited and become Yamasees, and then they also take out Appalachia. Working in partnership with the British. Tens of thousands of Indigenous people from Florida are enslaved, about 30 to 50,000. It's a creation of British imperialism. It's enacted on the ground through the British, but also through Indigenous people like the Yamasees and Creeks who want to survive and also want to grow in power. And so this is how they do it. In 1715, the Yamasees are now being targeted themselves by the British they're allied with, and they launch the largest pan-Indian war in the history of the South and bring that slave trade largely to an end. And in the wake of that, some Yamasees actually come and settle in St. Augustine. Others settle in other parts of Florida, and some will become part of the people who eventually become called the Seminoles. But it's a very long story. It takes 500 pages at least to tell the story. I printed it out. It's like 509 pages long. Oh my God. It's a very big story. So the Guales begin to move into our region. Where are we? I need my pointer. Into Amelia Island. There it is. And this now becomes Guales space. One of the things that I want to emphasize is even as Indigenous people move, they still think of former spaces as their homelands. We have this tendency to think that people who are mobile don't think of spaces as homelands even after they leave them. And that's simply not the case with the folks that I'm talking about today. There are other Indigenous communities that scholars have pointed to and said that these are highly mobilized individuals who don't create a sense of attachment to space, but that's not the case with the Mocamas, and it's not the case with the Guales, and it's not even the case with the Yamasees. A big part of my book is actually showing their attachment to space. So one of the interesting things that happens when the Yamasees move on to Amelia Island is that you might remember I said this had been Mocama space for a very, very long time. Well, in 1681, the Spanish start to get angry letters from Cassica Merenciana. She is the head Cassica of the Mocamas. She is the head paramount chief, essentially. And she begins to complain that the Yamasees have settled on her lands, on Amelia Island, on Cumberland Island, other spaces that are hers by right of inheritance. This is her people's land. It belongs to her ancestors. And so it belongs to her and her people, and they should be paying tribute. It's okay for them to live in that space, but they should be paying tribute. The Spanish governor responds by saying, well, it's wonderful that the Yamasees are here because we've had all this depopulation. We need laborers. We need other people to help protect, these spaces. You should just not charge them tribute. And by the way, this is the king's land. And she says, oh, no. This is not Spanish land. And my point here is that she's been living in a world where the Spanish have been trying to assert dominion over indigenous territory for a very long time by this period, right? This is 1681. They've been in St. Augustine since 1565. They've been moving into Mocamas since the 1580s. So it's 100 years of contact. And she says, no, this is still our land. A brand new piece just translated by Aaron Broadwell, that linguist I told you about, with a historian, Alejandro Dubkovsky, translates one of the first, they think it's the first, surviving letter in an indigenous language in North America. And it's in Timucua. It's just to the west of where we are today. And it's written by a chief, writing in 1651, saying, I lent the Spanish some land, and then the governor claimed that it was his land. But I'm telling you that it's not. This is our land. We lent it to him, and then he gave it to his son, and then his son tried to sell it, and it's still ours. And I'm very sorry, but we want it back. It is ours. We lent it repeatedly. We lent it, we lent it, we lent it. So a notion of indigenous ownership over land persists through Spanish colonization, persists. And indigenous people, even when they move, often still feel connected and claim spaces that we might say used to be theirs, but are still theirs. And so that's why I opened today with acknowledging that they did not cede these lands. These were their lands. And this is because this is what they say to us through the documents when we can see that. So this remains Guales space until at least 1702, when the infamous Moor assault happens. So in 1702, it's not just Moor, but several hundred Yamasees who launch a large-scale attack aimed at Amelia Island. And they come and they move progressively from the north to the south of the island. This is us here, from Tupiki further south. And word spreads very quickly of the assault, and within an hour, really, people are fleeing to the south end of the island. And ultimately, in the course of one night, they take down the remaining settlements of Wale and then move into mainland Mocama. And the English will then assault St. Augustine. And this is really, people say, the end of indigenous people in this space, but it's not the end of them. It's the end of them living in this territory, right? Many survivors go to St. Augustine, others go elsewhere. We know that the Creeks include Mocamas, so do the people who eventually become known as the Seminoles. So they don't simply go extinct. It's a really damaging concept. They move. They become part of other communities, much as the Guales have become part of the Yamasees. So this is fairly common. So this is totally new work. So I've written this 109-page book. Hopefully somebody wants to publish it. And so now I'm moving into really a more local indigenous history as well. The Yamasees were a wonderful way for me when I moved into this space to begin to think about local history, and I've more decisively moved into local history of late. And I'll talk about that. And one of the ways in which I'm beginning to look at this space, so this is very early work, is through powerful indigenous women. So what was remarkable about both the Mocama, Wale, and Yamasees is that these are all matrilineal societies, as are most of the people of the Native South. So what that means essentially in our terms is that children took their clan identities, we would say last names, from their mothers. And their mothers were the heads of their households. And I see all the women looking at me. The women ran the households and had a lot of power as a result of that. They were, both in cosmology and other sort of cultural forms, they were acknowledged to be extraordinarily powerful. There are a lot of pre-contact evidence of, for example, the corn mother. The production of corn and the ability to give life and to sustain was really tied into notions of female deities as really powerful. So I'm beginning to look at indigenous women because I know that they were extraordinarily powerful. In Mocama, they were called Ano Ulema, that means mother. just Webinary, just type it in, and boop, you can find out our local language. So I know that they were powerful, and I also know that the Spanish tried to erase them from their colonial archives, right? So a lot of the work that we're seeing coming out of my field right now is all about not only decolonizing museum spaces, but also decolonizing archival spaces, and recognizing the power of writing and the power of preserving documents is really a colonial one in many cases, and it's certainly the case when we look at Florida, right? That the Spanish and the French, and farther afield, the English, who will write a lot about people in this region and are coming into this region, all controlled archival spaces and did so decisively, right? Were intentional, wrote in a particular way, erased Indigenous women often when they were writing. For example, the British are famous for this. You know, when I was looking at the Yamasees, I could find the names of Yamasee men and never ever of women. They were always somebody's wife or somebody's sister, and they never had their own identity, and they very rarely were seen as political agents. Now, the Spanish are a bit better. They recognize begrudgingly the power of Indigenous women, but they recognize it. And what is remarkable is the way that that power persists through the colonial period on Amelia Island and in surrounding spaces. So I'm beginning to look at Indigenous women a lot because they are so powerful, and yet they're subject to the struggles over colonization. They're powerful in that they run their families, or the matriarchs. They're powerful in that where a woman lives is where her husband lives. They're also matrilocal. So men move a lot more than women in a sense, because these are also exogamous societies where you can't marry within your family clan. You have to marry outside of it. So there are a lot of men who move to different Indigenous women's communities to live with their wives in the households of their family. Oftentimes, leadership is also matrilineal. So it's not your son who takes over the caciqueship or the chieftainship. It is your nephew. It is your sister's son. That is the important line. That is the important relationship. It's very different. It's very, very different. So women remain both powerful and also remain victimized by colonization. For the Spanish and for many Europeans, there's often a twinning of conquest of women and conquest of land. So we see a lot of sexual exploitation, a lot of rape, a lot of the notion that this is part of taking over land is destroying Indigenous women. They're often targeted, and we see that in our region. But there are particular Spanish lieutenants, for example. There's a big sex scandal where a Spanish lieutenant in the 1690s here on Amelia Island is accused of taking an Indigenous woman, probably against her will, as his sexual conquest. And he responds to this series of charges by local Indigenous leaders saying, you know, Guale leaders saying this is wrong, by saying, oh, it's not me, it was one of the Guale leaders. And at the center of the struggle is this Indigenous woman, you know, being sexually exploited and owned and targeted. And yet, again, they maintain their power in all of these fascinating ways. And so one of the things that I've just started doing is tracking Cassicas. So what's remarkable in our region is there are so many female leaders. They're not only leaders of their families, they're leaders of their entire communities. And these are just a few. This is not comprehensive. This is just what a few Spanish records have given me so far. But I started early to show that even from sort of early contact, we're already seeing really powerful Indigenous female leaders. These are chiefs, and they are women who are running their communities. So in 1606, Maria is a cacica of Alimacani, or San Juan del Puerto, and that is on Fort George Island. And then I sort of jump ahead to show, because this is the period I'm most interested in at the moment. This is a really interesting set of lineage. In 1665, Juana of Santa Maria on Amelia Island becomes the cacica. And when she becomes the cacica, she also becomes the cacica of all of Mocama. She becomes the head cacica. So it's not just of her town, it's the entire region. And then in 1677, she says, I'm old enough, it's time to retire, and I'm going to have my niece take over. And she appoints her niece as the next cacica, Maranchiana, and she becomes the cacica of all of Mocama as well, the entire region. And so what's amazing is how it persists. Maranchiana, I can keep finding her. I find her into the early 18th century, still as the main cacica. There's this one point where the Spanish try to say she's the wife of the cacique, but I already know that she's gotten it through her own power. that he has become more powerful by marrying her, because she already held the seat of power. And so the Spanish struggle with this, and yet they also allow me to reconstruct it to a really important extent. So women are the anchors of their communities in so many ways. They anchor their families, and here they also run their entire communities and negotiate with the Spanish as a result. So one of the things that's fascinating is the persistence of this, even onto the eve of sort of the collapse of this region. And this is actually what got me interested in thinking about the power of Indigenous women. In 1701, there's this remarkable series of orders, and they replicate orders that have already been given. It's called an auto. And the Spanish go around and they tack this up in the council house of every Indigenous community on Amelia Island. And the council house is the center of political power. Every community has a council house that is a town. A major Indigenous town is defined by having one of these. It's like the Capitol building. It's usually a large, round structure that can hold everyone in the community, but can also hold guests. So if you haven't been to Mission San Luis in Tallahassee and want to go do an outing, this is an amazing space to go and see, because they've reconstructed what is an enormous council house. Huge. It's very impressive to go into that space. It could have held, I think, 2,000 people. Huge. Now, the council houses in our region were probably a little bit smaller than that, but still, they were meant to be public spaces. They would also be where foreign dignitaries would come and sleep. So they're sort of the space for foreigners. So these council houses were places also where orders were placed. And so here are the Spanish trying to assert order. And what's been happening since the 1680s is that the Yamasees have left. Hundreds of Guales have left with them. And other people have left too, Mocamas, and it's shrinking. The whole area is shrinking. And the folks who are staying are the Caciques and Cassicas, because in negotiation with the Spanish, they have a lot of authority and they have a lot of rights. And so the folks who are mostly leaving are mostly the folks who are supposed to do all the work. They're the ones being told to do all the work. So they're the ones leaving and joining the Yamasees in particular. And it's fascinating to read the complaints, the grievances of Cassicas and Caciques, who are repeatedly saying, like, there's fewer and fewer people to do the work. Who's gonna farm? Who's gonna, repair the houses? Because we're not gonna do it. But we've only got like 12 guys left now who want to do it. So there's all of this mobility and all of these people moving, and it's happening in Appalachia, and it's happening in Western Timucua and into our region, Eastern Timucua, Mocama, and Guales. And the Spanish are trying to control it. And they're watching what they say. At one point, the governor, Zuniga, says, I'm watching the Guales go little by little to the Yamasees. I love that idea. Little by little. It's like overnight, people are just leaving, repeatedly leaving. So they're trying to maintain control, and they're worried about the British invading, which they're about to do, right? The British and Yamasees are about to invade. So they issue this auto, and it's tacked up in every council house, and they have a big, series of councils also with Cassicas and Caciques to say, like, these are the things you're supposed to be doing. And they're really interesting. They're supposed to live as Christians. They're supposed to sow a community field. They're not supposed to meddle in royal jurisdiction. They're not supposed to punish Caciques, Micos, and Alaguitas, and so this is a direction to the Spanish. Don't start punishing the few leaders we have left. Indians are supposed to have a pass to travel. So-called blacks and mulattoes who are being used as couriers are allowed to come into the area, but then they need to leave really quickly. Don't stay, don't linger too long. Indian dances cannot be banned, right? There's a fear of collusion there, clearly. Indian dances should not be banned, which have been a big controversy in Florida with Franciscans trying to ban indigenous dances and seeing them as a form of idolatry. Indian women, I thought this was really interesting, also have the right to determine whether they dance or not, which implies that they're being forced to dance, right, publicly. Indians are only to be used as couriers in emergencies, and what this shows, who are the couriers? They're not the Spanish. Who's controlling communication networks? Not the Spanish. Lieutenants and caciques are supposed to ensure privileges and favors are upheld, make sure all the elites are happy. Canoes are to be at every crossing, and Indians are to be ready with their arms, and it says firearms in particular, because they've been invaded repeatedly, and so there's a fear that they're going to be invaded again. Soldiers are still supposed to be supported by indigenous labor, but not just any Spaniard can come into the area and expect to be taken care of. And so that's been happening. So every time you see one of these, that means this has been happening. Natives are allowed to plant their fields wherever they damn well please, right? As long as they're not unappropriated. Native people, indigenous people. And then this is the one that got me. I ordered that they not consent that Indians from other provinces who are married remain in this one, but rather they are to give me an account of it so that they may go to live a married life with their wives and assist them. So on its surface, this seems like control, right? They're indigenous men like moving, and they just need to go and live with their wives. And then you remember that these are matrilocal communities, that this is an indigenous practice, that the power of women is they determine that their husbands live with them, that they run their households. And the only way that the Spanish can try to control indigenous populations is to move and work through matrilocality. So even though this sounds like a Spanish order and we're the ones taking control, if we read between the lines, what we see are that indigenous women still run their families, still determine where men live. And if the Spanish want to stop Indian men from moving around, they have to work through Indian women. They have to support matrilocality, which is not our Spanish custom. This is an indigenous practice that predates colonization. So here is evidence of its persistence, that despite over 100 years of colonization, indigenous women are still in charge of their families, and they're still in charge of their towns, and we know that. So I want you to take away a few things from today's talk, and I'm going to talk for just a few more minutes about the takeaways, but then also my new projects. And I'm really eager for, I know, I never stop. I literally turned to my book and then, I'm exhausted. I literally turned to my book and was like, oh, I got to do all these other things.
Oh my God.
Okay, so these are the things that I want you to take away. So Amelia Island was a hub in a much larger indigenous world through the early 18th century. When we tell stories of Indians in many public spaces, not in this wonderful museum, but many other museums, they just disappear. They're there and they're sort of backdrop actors. They're here. Often we'll see things like they had not changed for 500 to 1,000 years. You'll see this in most of the museums that you go to in Jacksonville today. The Timucuas had not changed for 1,000 years until the French and Spanish arrived, which is an absolutely ludicrous statement. No society has that kind of lack of change. All societies change, right? That's just on a universal level. But actually what it's saying is Europeans were modern and indigenous people were not. They were ancient, had never changed, and then came modern Europeans and indigenous people couldn't live in that society. And then you'll often see that they just disappear from the museum space. Yeah. They're just gone. And we don't know why. Usually it's disease. It's a very convenient killer because we don't have to talk about the violence, the structural violence, the intentional violence of colonization if it's just disease. And so that's another thing that I want you to take away from this. And this is the last point, but I'll come back to indigenous women. Spanish colonization, including missionization, was by design destructive and violent. It was intended to be. Missionaries came into these spaces with the intention to destroy indigenous cultures, to destroy indigenous faiths, to directly confront them. Indigenous people came from a very different perspective. So the Mocamas, for example, were part of a world in which for thousands of years they had talked about religion with other people of different faiths. That when the Jesuits and Franciscans arrive in Florida, it's not the first time that indigenous people start talking about religion. Oh, you believe that? We believe that. You have this sacred story? We have this sacred story. This isn't the first time they've talked about theology. They're deeply religious people. And at the same time, their construction of religion is very different. The Spanish have hard and fast rules of what they expect conversion to mean. Indigenous people, when we look profoundly at how they're interpreting Catholicism, and when we also look comparatively at how other indigenous people encounter the Spanish, it's a very different process. Their religions, their faiths are not threatened by change. They can incorporate new ideas, and they're still Mocama. They can incorporate elements of Catholicism, and it doesn't mean they're not indigenous. They are supposed to change, like all indigenous communities, like all human communities over time. And so this is something that I would say too. So did the Spanish. The Spanish change over time as well. And they're changed by their interactions with indigenous people. We are often stuck in old assimilation models where we assume that indigenous people are vessels who receive Spanish culture and receive Spanish religion. This is really not the way that it's working. Remember that often a missionary is alone. He's often alone. in an indigenous world. Sometimes he might have a Spanish soldier or two, depending on the time period. But he's generally living, sometimes for decades, alone in an indigenous world. Going back to St. Augustine to see his brothers, but coming back into those indigenous communities. The people he interacts with, the people he breaks bread with are indigenous. He has changed. They are changed through that interaction, right? It's not a one-way street. And then, of course, my last takeaway is indigenous women retain political and social power in their communities. And I'm starting to really begin to explore that, even as Spanish colonization is destructive, is exploitative, is violent. Okay, so I'm working on, I have 2 pages of projects. I'm working on some new projects that I wanted to share. So Andrew Frank and I have just co-edited the Florida Historical Quarterly special issue on Indigenous Florida. So we recruited 4 really exciting scholars, and this is coming out in October. If you're interested in learning more about Indigenous Florida more generally, we have a great piece on the Appalachian Revolt that rethinks that entire encounter. We have 2 pieces that look at Creek Indians moving into and claiming parts of Florida in the 18th century. And then we have a really exciting piece, too, that looks at Vero Beach and the way in which white settlers inventively claimed aspects and stories of an imagined indigenous past while they also erased the Seminoles from the present. And that's really fun. That's coming out next month. There's also a preview of that. Andrew and I interviewed all of the contributors to that, and that just dropped. We have a 1-hour interview with all of them where we talk about the importance of indigenous history to Florida and the importance of changing the way in which we tend to exclude indigenous history from our telling of the state's history. So that's really fun. That's free, and that's on the Florida Historical Society's website. It was part of their annual virtual meeting. You'll just see Indigenous Florida. You click on it, and you can watch a 1-hour video where we're talking about all of this. I've also just started a new book project with Keith Ashley, who's the archaeologist at the University of North Florida who works on local archaeology. Some of you might, in fact, have met or know him. He's probably on Amelia Island and Port George Island and Black Hammock, and he's always around here. And we are writing a public-facing book called Heka Utamile, which is Our Land in Mocama in our indigenous language, an indigenous history of Northeast Florida. It's going to be really short, because I wrote this big book. I want to write a really nice, short book, really lovely, accessible book. And what we're trying to do is really take all of the exciting scholarship that's happening, that Keith's doing, that I'm doing, that linguists are doing, that other historians are doing, and make it accessible to everybody, and write a full history of our region from indigenous perspectives. And so as part of that, we're working with UNF students this semester, and we're creating digital humanities projects. And to me, this just means we're putting a bunch of exciting stuff on the website, and that they, in their smart 21st century orientation, are coming up with really creative ways to talk about the indigenous past. And we're confronting several myths as we do this, because we see these myths kind of circulating in the public. The first myth that we're confronting is the idea that local indigenous history starts with contact. And so Keith actually specializes in the 11th and 12th centuries. So we're doing a very deep indigenous history of the region that starts in that period. And that really goes, in some ways, into the present. We sort of go into the 18th century and then also end with indigenous communities today in the state. The second myth that we're confronting is that idea of Catholic conversion. So there's this real tendency to assume that because a friar came to an indigenous community and performed baptisms, that magically all of these thousands of indigenous people became Catholics. Some did. A small proportion of indigenous people who converted became Catholics in the way that the Spanish expected, and the vast majority did not. The records where we see this being written, right, where we see, like, I converted and baptized 1,000 indigenous people, in a month, are often letters being written to superiors asking for resources. We need more friars. Look how successful we've been. We need more funding. Look how successful we've been. Now, I write grant applications, so I understand. You got to sell and pitch your project. So we are more critically going to interrogate this. And then the last one, which I'm really excited about, is that especially this is with my master's students, who are a tremendous group who've been with me for a while, we are writing an indigenous history of Fort Caroline. Wow. And that really needs to be told. For a very long time, that story has been told as just between the French and the Spanish, but they're sitting right there in Mocama territory, and they're actually on Indigenous land. And a lot of what's happening is being put into motion by Indigenous people, or what's not happening is being put into motion by Indigenous people. So we're going to do an Indigenous history of the Fort Caroline experience, which I'm very excited about. And also to kind of unpack the mythologizing a little bit. We're going to do a lot of, where did this myth start? Because there's a lot of myth making with the Fort Caroline experience. So anyway, those are just a few things that are keeping me busy at night so that I don't get into trouble. Yes. Where is Fort Caroline? It's in the water. It's probably in the water. You know, Keith and Buzz looked for it for so long. I think it's I think they tend to lean that it's in the water. You know, that it's underwater, and that we probably aren't gonna find it. I know. Well, we would find it through the Spanish, right? That's how Charles Fort was discovered, or uncovered, not discovered, but uncovered. Is the Spanish always, when they take over a French or Indigenous space, the Spanish like to put their own space right on top of it. So that's how you find it, right? You find the San Mateo, and then underneath you'll find Fort Caroline. But I don't know that we will. It is not in the St. Mary's, and it is not in Georgia. It is here in Florida. There's some interesting theories. I mean, you'd have to ignore thousands of Spanish documents talking about where it is to say that it's not in this region. It is definitely in this region. Don't worry. Yes?
Was it Fort Caroline the first attempt at European colonization in this whole hemisphere?
No.
No? What was?
I mean, there are much earlier French efforts. I mean, it depends. So, you know, the Spanish are in this area, we know, by at least 1513, if not earlier. For slaving. There are other efforts in Canada. I mean, there's just, and the firsting idea is really about displacing Indigenous people too. I mean, so that's part of it, right? That there are a lot of firsts that happen before Europeans arrive. So that's part of what we're trying to reframe. So we're trying to shift from thinking of, you know, this is the first, or for example, the oldest city in North America is not St. Augustine. There are two older Indigenous cities that have been continuously occupied, in one case since the 11th century, in one case since the 13th century. So a lot of the firsting is part of our idea to sort of shift Fort Caroline from this very brief moment where the Spanish and French clash to this much larger history of powerful networked Indigenous communities that Europeans are trying to access and tap into from coastal settlements on Indigenous lands, and are bumbling around and really mucking it up as they do. Yes. But it's going to be exciting work, and we're only just starting that work. And we're hoping to partner with the National Park as we do that too. A big part of this emphasis is public history. Right, is making everything that we do accessible. So you will be able to find the site, you will be able to go onto it, and what's fun is to work with students on this kind of research. It's really exciting, and they come up with a lot of the best ideas. We guide them through the research, and then they often are the most innovative in terms of how to present the research. So that's really fun. Yeah.
Because symbols are so important. I'm sitting here thinking that we have to reinvent this 8 flags thing that we have.
We might have said something like that in our intro to the Florida Historical Quarterly. Yeah. The flags are really hard. The flags are really hard because they say a flag equals a nation.
Right.
And Indigenous people don't have nations, so they don't get flags. And of course they do. It's one of the fictions of colonization and post-colonization to say that Indigenous people weren't nations and didn't have territorial boundaries. I can tell you that the Yamasees, who moved very regularly, established firm territorial boundaries. In fact, in one instance, they lobbied the South Carolina government in 1707 and get their definition of their lands into South Carolina statute. And for a long time, scholars have interpreted that statute as the South Carolinians establishing a reservation that hems the Yamasees in. It is an enormous swath of territory that the South Carolinians want. And the authors of that act are very close allies of the Yamasees. And that's already where they live. And so they establish those boundaries. And they legally advocate to get it into South Carolina statutes. So it's a fiction, right, that they aren't nations by any measure. That they understand and recognize and define territorial boundaries well before contact. We see that in the archaeological record. They are nations. Yep, and they deserve a flag if we're going to go by flags. Many flags. Many flags. Yep, that's really important. You're right, symbols really matter. And when kids see that and they don't,
Right,
yeah,
right.
yeah, that's right. That's where it starts with children.
Yeah.
Yep, you're right. Yes.
So, one of my volunteer activities is to do tours of downtown. And we start out with the Timucuan, you know, they were here for 4,000 years, blah, 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 blah. And it turns out probably everything I've been telling people is wrong.
It's okay.
So is it even appropriate to talk about Timucuans on this island?
Yeah.
Or is it Mocama? I don't understand.
So yeah, so Timucua is a big language family made up of many dialects, at least 11 that we know of. And Mocama is one of the dialects of Timucua.
Okay.
So Timucua isn't political, it's not even ethnic, it's linguistic. And Mocama is similarly linguistic, but we have started to use it to refer to a regional space that includes many different polities who are independent but then increasingly become associated over the 17th century.
Okay.
Yeah. So you can, so Timucua's not wrong. Yeah.
Yeah.
Timucua's not wrong. We're just trying to be even more specific
More-
and use
more
the Mocama
precise.
dialect, and that's why you have a big brewery, right? Mocama.
Yeah.
That was like, woo! My daughter looked at it, she went, they're bad. Like,
Finally.
A lot of research went into that.
I know a lot of research has
So-
to go into that.
So
yes.
one of the other things I've been taught, and I'm
Yes.
hearing is not true,
Yeah.
is that the Timucuans have completely died out, that there are no more.
So my counter is that that they didn't die out. They didn't go extinct. They weren't dinosaurs. We're not going to use a paleontological construct to talk about them. That they moved, right? And that they moved over time. That yes, many were enslaved. A certain number died through epidemics. A certain number absolutely died through the violence of colonialism, the toll that it took on their bodies to be in the repartimiento labor system, you know, direct frontal assaults. But that they didn't all die out.
But disease was a huge element of that.
That was part of it, but it wasn't the big killer.
Okay.
So disease by itself does not kill the majority of indigenous populations around the Americas. This is a mythology that emerged in the 1970s, and it was propagated by one scholar in particular who started talking about virgin soil epidemics. And he was trying to do a good thing. He was trying to say, I need to point to the damage of colonialism, but inadvertently by pointing to only disease and not talking about all of the other intentional structural elements of colonialism, he sort of made a passive argument that let colonialism off the hook in a sense.
Yeah.
So more exciting work by Paul Kelton, especially in the Native South, and he has two books. One is on centrality of the slave trade to the fluorescence of region-wide epidemics. So his first big argument is region-wide epidemics in the South, region-wide, not localized, don't occur until beginning in 1696, late. And that's because only then do we have networks and large refugee populations and large child populations, because it takes children, European children, to create disease, to create epidemic conditions, because they're the carriers. Adults are not usually coming, so Spanish men and French men and English men have already had smallpox as children. They don't have it as adults. So it takes a certain number of conditions in order to create that. So it's not till 1696. There are regional, but not region-wide epidemics. The second book he's got on the Cherokees looks at how they recover from epidemics. So epidemics don't mean the end of a society.
No.
That's not what gets them. It's the violence that comes with it, right? So it's not just a silent killer. It's then that, especially in the case of the Cherokees, when he looks at conditions on the ground, it's often direct frontal assaults by the British Army, by British militia. That's what kills them, right? It's dislocations. It's being dislocated from their food, from access to food, from their homelands. So, and what he finds with the Cherokees is that they're one of the first to adopt smallpox inoculation. So this also goes along with one of the mythologies that they don't respond well and innovate to disease, and they do. So it takes a whole host of things. It's not just disease. But we see that argument circulate throughout our region, that disease killed them and then they're just gone. And then we can just focus on the Spanish. And that's very convenient for the narrative. Yes, go ahead.
I was curious about, we're always talking docent tours about the Franciscans versus what was different about them versus who was there before?
The Jesuits.
The Jesuits.
Yeah.
What was different about their methods on conversion of natives?
So a lot of things were different. The Franciscans proved to be more lasting than the Jesuits, I think partly because of timing and then partly because of methodology, right? That they were very willing to integrate themselves to some extent into communities. They spent a lot of time in Florida learning languages, but they were pretty bad at learning those languages, we're recently discovering. And Jesuits were very successful in other regions. Like the French Jesuits were extraordinarily successful, but the Spanish Jesuits just in this region weren't. And we see it, you know, for example, Spanish Dominicans being very successful in other regions. So I think it's a matter of timing and context as well as approach and methodology. Yeah. Yes.
She keeps missing.
Did the indigenous people have a written language? And if so, are there any written documents in the original?
This is a great question. No, this is a great question. So, and it's a question that I literally just solved in my head this week. So I'm very excited. Not because of me, because of another scholar. We were meeting with this really exciting French scholar who's written this phenomenal book on the French Atlantic, and she looks very briefly at encounters between local indigenous people in our region as one of her many examinations, and the French. And she helped me to solve a riddle. So for a long time we've said indigenous people here and elsewhere didn't have a written language. And yet when you read Spanish records, they talk about how quickly they become literate, like 6 months. And so let's say the Spanish are exaggerating because they're very prone to exaggeration. So say they become literate in like 2 years still. To go from not being literate to being literate is incredible. That is masterfully quick. And I mentioned, or I alluded to, one of the things that Broadwell has discovered is that the main Franciscan, long thought to have been the person who translated all of this Mocama language material, all of this Timucua material, the second largest corpus in North America of indigenous language materials, that it was him doing it. Well, Broadwell has found that he was actually a very poor linguist. He made really simple grammatical mistakes, like really simple errors. So the real linguists are those Timucua, are those Mocamas speaking Timucuas. So how did they become literate so quickly, right? How did they master this if they were illiterate? And in my mind, I was thinking of alternate forms of literacy, and here I collapsed space and time, which you're never supposed to do. My daughter went to Montessori school, and when she was about 3, I can remember all she wanted to do was wash babies, wash baby dolls. I had to like buy all the stuff and put it in our house, and hours she would wash these baby dolls. And her teachers would tell me this is going to make her more literate. But they actually explained it, right? That learning these kind of mechanical things would help. And so I started to think, right, so there are tools and obviously the foundations for literacy already in Mocama communities, but I couldn't figure out the link. So reading this scholar's work, she focuses especially on nonverbal forms of communication, sign language, whistle language, which I now think the Mocamas had, because one of the phrases that Aaron Broadwell translated for us in our other museum, where you can press the button and hear Mocama, is, "Did you whistle at the wind to make it rain?" So they're definitely whistling as a form of communication. They're whistling, they're using sign language. We know that she analyzes French and Timucua local interaction. She finds all sorts of gestures. She argues there is a form of sign language in this region. They are already literate, but they're not literate in the way that we think. They're not writing things down, but they're communicating in all sorts of ways that code, right, that then lead to very rapid acquisition of literacy. When I read this, I was like, oh, you know, like all the light bulbs went off, and I said, does this make sense? And she was like, absolutely. So that's the answer. They're not writing, but they very rapidly learn to write, and they are writing in both Spanish and their indigenous languages very quickly in this region. And that's what we have. We have these miraculous documents, thousands of pages of carefully written Mocama, not just translations of Spanish Franciscan texts, but reinterpretations of them. And this is how we know that it wasn't the Franciscans doing it, because the stuff that the Mocamas are saying is not stuff that the Franciscans were saying. Stuff about sex with partners of maybe the same sex sometimes. Things about abortion, like, it's not such a bad thing, but did you do it? Like, did you get rid of that problem that you had? No judgment. I'm not judging you, right? Franciscans are going to judge you. So all sorts of cases we see again and again that they're reinterpreting and saying, like, this is how it works in our world. This is what the Franciscans want to ask you about. I'm going to explain it to you. right? And so it's not, and sometimes the Spanish section's like this and the Mocamas section's like,
Wow.
yeah. Like I gotta tell you, okay, they believe in just one God, so let me explain that to you, right? So there's lots and lots of that. And there's this brand new piece and some of that's been published. There's like little bits. If you look for Broadwell and Dubkovsky, there's some really good articles that I've been teaching. And his goal ultimately is to put all of it online. To translate all of it and put it all online and make it accessible to everyone. And it will radically change what we understand about conversion, what we understand about our local Mocama people, because it's all them writing about their engagement with Catholicism and what it means to them. And in other places where we have that kind of rich corpus, what we find is an incredible indigenization of Christianity. That they understand Christianity tremendously well, and they reinterpret it through their own indigenous frameworks.
Of course.
And it's remarkable work. So I'm beyond excited for that to come out.
Where were the documents that the Mocama wrote found?
So a lot of it's been out there. It's not like hidden. A lot of it was published. They published these things in the 17th century, right? Because they were training manuals for other Franciscans. So it's not been undiscovered. I mean, there was one of these documents that was cataloged at the Oxford Library in only their local library, and it hadn't connected. They have all of these colleges at Oxford. It hadn't connected to the main system, and when they connected it to the main system, it like popped up.
Yeah.
And a religious studies professor from Flagler was like, "Oh, another one we didn't know about." I mean, it wasn't lost. It just the catalogs hadn't matched up. So we've had all of this. So that is the big question. The big question is why did it take till the 21st century for a linguist to say, hey, this stuff is really important.
Yeah.
And there's a ton of it. And we're not looking at it. We've often had, and there's one published version of one of the Spanish side of it. But nobody's gone and translated the Mocama side. So he had to reconstruct the whole language. He's amazing. You should talk to him. He had to reconstruct the whole language, and then he could translate all of it. But why did it sit there for so long? Yeah.
We have time for maybe another one.
Okay, that's fine. Okay. Yes.
Looking at, or listening again to what you've said, it seems like the indigenous people are mainly peace-loving.
Okay.
In your study, do you see them as a moral people, that there's a strong moral fiber within the community?
It's a very loaded question. I'm gonna admit that it's very loaded. So I think every culture has I think morality is culturally specific. This is what's moral within our culture. The Spanish have their own moral, the way that they judge and assess morality. And so do indigenous people. Sometimes there are loose parallels where you can say, like, here are places where they agree, and then often there are things where they don't agree. And so that's what's interesting, right? Scholars try to be culturally relativistic. We try to assess cultures within their own context and to understand them within their own context,
Right.
and not to step out and say, this is what matters to me.
Right.
Are you matching up?
No judgment.
Right, instead to say, I want to understand why this makes sense in your culture. So that's what we aim to do. So peace-loving, there's great value to peace, but there's also great value to violence. Violence is also, in many of these communities, a major way in which men become men. Men make their way in the world first by learning to hunt animals, and also by learning to hunt humans when it's strategically important, when it's necessary. So these are martial cultures, as are the Spanish, right? That is one area of confluence. Masculinity is actually often understood across cultures because they have loosely similar masculine displays. Women are constructed very differently in these communities. And that's why Mary becomes so important. I didn't get to that, but you see so many Marias because Mary becomes really important as a point of contact between these communities. Because she's a mother figure that indigenous people can say, well, that makes sense in our culture because you seem to not have so many of those. So let's look at this mother figure. Yeah. Well, thank you so much for having me. Yes, thank you, Denise, and thank you all for coming, and we hope to see you at the programs next month. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Bossy.
Thank you.